Snow gathers on the eaves like a slow, soft punctuation. It presses along the curve of the roof, beads against the wooden tiles, and then yields, a hush that makes the world smaller. Against that white hush, steam rises in visible breaths from the onsen, thin columns that curl and catch the lantern light before sinking back into the cold. Lanterns, small and stubborn, line the narrow path up to the lodge. Paper shades warmed from within, their light pooled and tremulous over packed snow. Beyond them, beyond the trees that knit into a dark fringe, Mount Fuji keeps its shape. A low, blue-black cone under the scattering of stars. For a moment, the peak is only a silhouette, and above it the night is a scatter of bright pinpoints. Stars hung very exact, like pins set in cloth. The innkeeper walks that thin theater between steam and snow. She moves with habits that are older than any schedule. Hands that remember where the kettles like to sit, how a futon will settle into its corner, how the norin should hang so a guest arriving late can find the warmth without having to ask for it. Her name is one kept more by the house than by any single person in the valley. People call her what they need: keeper, host, one who knows the ways of the lodge. Tonight her steps are muffled by a pair of wool socks and the packed snow on the engawa, the porch that runs the length of the building. Thin boards warmed by the bodies passing. She pauses at the threshold and listens. The onsen exhales, a steady hiss. The cat beneath the eaves breathes slow and small. The lanterns whisper at their glass. She reaches up and smooths the norin, the short curtain at the entrance that marks inside and outside, and her fingers find a place where the weave is tired. There is a thread bare at the hem, a small V-shaped tear that looks, for a moment, as if it might be a moth's mercy instead of wear. The curtain hangs loyal to its hook, but there is a surrender in that one place where the cold has made seams brittle. When she draws the norin aside and steps into the lobby, where the shoji screens slide with a dry sigh and the kettle sings its low note, she notices the plank on the engawa that has cupped with damp. A narrow board, nearest the doorway, has bowed just enough to catch at the hem of a kimono being pulled on or a heavy boot passing in. It is nothing dramatic. It is precisely the kind of small failure that, unattended, will become a story told later as annoyance or misfortune. She counts the planks with her eye, the way a person counts stitches in a familiar cardigan, and then she sets the kettle to cool and moves to the storeroom. The storeroom is not a tidy thing. It is a particular kind of order. Tools nested against each other like small animals. Lengths of timber stood shoulder to shoulder and labeled. Waxed threads coiled on a peg. A roll of washi paper folded into a square. The cat follows, as cats follow every human ritual, circling once and pressing itself against a stack of futons where it finds a pocket of heat. The innkeeper lays a hand on a slice of oak she remembers buying with the carpenter. Brown and honest, the grain a map, and carries it back like something precious and ordinary. Outside, the sky holds. A few constellations are scattered in neat lines. Orion is not yet dethroned by dawn, and near the mountain the stars seem to stand closer together, as if they were making a careful audience for the night. She steps onto the engawa, the wood cool beneath her soles, and sets the plank where the old warped board lies. The cat watches, tail a slow metronome. A soft invitation is the sort that takes no shape but lingers. If this calm suits you, stay with us a little longer. Let the minute sounds gather around you, the hiss of the onsen, the scrape of a plane on shavings, the small conversation between hands and material. Stay and see what such small attentions do when given time. There is no hurry in the house. Guests arrive as they need to, some late, snow-rubbed and grateful for the lantern's proof of life, and some are regulars who have learned that the lodge keeps its own calendar. On nights like this, when the lanterns make small planets along the path and the stars above the peak seem to arrange themselves into something deliberate, people come with the quietness of those who have walked many miles to stand in a place of shelter. The elder arrives first, carrying a jar of preserved daikon, tucked like a small offering against his chest, his breath puffing and brief in the cold. He loosens his scarf and nods at the innkeeper, eyes crinkling in a way that makes the lines of his face read like a hand-stitched map. The gardener is next, hands smelling faintly of earth even in winter, bringing sprigs of cedar and a small bundle of straw that he suggests for packing. 2 apprentices trail behind him, one with a folding saw clutched like a chinless thing, the other carrying a bundle of needles and waxed thread. They are not young in the way of youth, perhaps. They are apprentices in the slow sense. People who have come to learn how to wait a corner with gentleness, to turn a misfit into a seam, to make a house that keeps things rather than discarding them. The carpenter arrives last, as if summoned by the sound of wood. He moves with the quiet surety of someone who reads grain like braille. Hands stained from evenings of planing, he opens his case with a small ceremony of careful taps and the smell of oil. They lay the things out on the floor. A plane with a blade honed so that it sings under pressure. A mallet with rounded corners, thin strips of oak measured and trimmed to more than allowance, waxed thread smelling faintly of bees and smoke, a spool of fine cotton for the Noren's mend, and a sheet of washi paper translucent as breath for lining. Each tool has a place. The apprentice with needles holds them like a new instrument, fingers tentative at first, then settling. Work in this lodge is a public ritual without fuss. There is no audience. Rather, there is a mutual attendance. The elder brings his daikon, and, after paying a courtly, crooked compliment about the innkeeper's teas, places the jar on the counter as a small insurance bid against the world's rudeness. The gardener sets his cedar against a pole beam to lend a scent like a memory of summer. The carpenter sets his square on a piece of timber and draws a line with a pencil that is more a promise than a command. The innkeeper watches as if she has time to watch everything. She breathes when the others breathe and keeps the kettle warm. They begin with the Noren, because the door is the house's voice. A torn curtain, however small, is a voice with a fray. To mend it is to let the house speak again in a steady way. The apprentice threads a needle clumsily at first. The carpenter corrects the angle of the stitch with a finger that does not scold as much as redirect. The innkeeper chooses the stitch, not decorative but honest, redoubling the hem, anchoring the loose ends so they will not bloom again with each passing foot. The thread is waxed to ride the fibers smooth. The wax smells like the lanterns, warm and a little sweet. As the needle moves through the cloth, the apprentice learns how much pressure to let fall on the thumb, how to catch the weave without tearing it, how to knot in a way that refuses to unravel. The correction is a touch at the knuckle, the tilt of a wrist, a word no longer than necessary. The stitch, repeated, becomes a rhythm. Poke, pull, press. Poke, pull, press. The needle makes tiny whispers on the fabric. The lantern light makes tiny moons on skin. The cat sits below and drips a slow gaze up at the hem, then returns to its sleep. When they turn to the plank, the air tips inwards. The plank is measured with the kind of patience that comes from a life of fitting pieces together until edges agree. The carpenter places the new strip alongside the old and checks the grain. He wants the new piece to be a conversation partner to the lodge's existing wood, not an imposition. He planes along the edge, and the shavings fall in pale curls like haircut in a quiet barber shop. Each shaving is thin and translucent and smells faintly of sap. The apprentice with the saw watches the grain as if it were being translated from a foreign tongue. The carpenter points, just once, where to make the line. The apprentice takes the saw and sets his weight, a careful rhythm of pull and let. A song that is mostly patience. The cut is true, and the boards match. The carpentry breathes, and the lodge nods a small private approval. They fit the plank in place and feel for wobble and give. Sometimes a wedge is needed, sometimes a shim carved from cedar that the gardener supplies. They work by subtraction until fit is achieved. A little off here, a plane again there. A test step to see if the hem of a garment catches. Conversation during repair is small and spare. It gathers like warm air and then lets itself go. The elder says, in a voice like dry grass, that his father used to mend with a particular trick. Fold the thread back through twice where friction will be greatest. The gardener adds that his grandmother used to line a noren with washi to stop draft, and the innkeeper nods and makes a note with the corner of her mouth, as if this kind of information is currency. The apprentices listen and repeat, learning the weight of a phrase as much as its technique. There are no long stories. There are fragments, an image of a hand, a taste of preserved daikon, the memory of a cold night made better by someone who waited. Outside, the night is patient. The stars, a little higher now because the onsen's steam lifts and the night draws in, form a shallow bowl above Mount Fuji's peak. A constellation of smaller details. A satellite that moves like a distant thought. A bird's faint silhouette crossing the western backcloth. Rare things that punctuate the otherwise steady scene. At one point, the innkeeper steps out onto the engawa, the noren held back by a careful knot, and stands to look up. She holds the new spool of waxed thread in her hand, and with the other, she catches a breath that stings with cold. She lifts her face to the stars, and for a moment she is larger and smaller at the same time. Part of a house that keeps people and a person kept by the sweep of weather and habit. There is a small moment, almost an accident, where the stars seem to answer the work. As the carpenter taps a wedge in place with a mallet, a particularly bright star over the peak throws a clean pin of white. It catches on the mallet's metallic ring and makes a tiny, separate rhythm. The apprentice notices and smiles, a private gratitude like a hand making a small sign. The innkeeper breathes, and the house takes that breath with her. The neighbor arrives with oddments as the work settles into a long, low hum. He is an exchangeable kind of person, part lender and part historian of small things. A jar of buttons, a spool of thread, a strip of leather he says might be useful in a pinch. He does not demand thanks, but receives it with a grace like an ancient song. He sets the leather down beside the tools and asks where his old hammer is kept. The gardener passes him a cup of tea with hands that smell of cedar and soil, and he nods, tasting the tea like a person tasting weather. At the inn's edge, near the onsen, the stranger first appears as a small disturbance in the lane. A movement at the edge of the lantern light, and then a shape that pauses as if checking that the house will receive. For now, the stranger is only a shadow beyond the path, hands in pockets and shoulders hunched against the cold. The lantern nearest throws a warm circle where a face might be. The innkeeper, who has spent much of her life learning the geometry of arrival, watches without rushing. Houses that keep people know the difference between invitation and imposition. The door is opened by a small, precise decision. Whether to make room. Inside the lodge, the apprentices continue their mends, learning the subtleties of a line and of the discipline that makes a house mended rather than patched. The carpenter speaks rarely, but when he shapes a corner, the apprentice watches the way his thumb presses the plane, the way he listens with an ear close to the timber as if wood has a voice. Feel the grain, the carpenter says only once, and the apprentice returns the plane to the wood with less hesitation. The mallet taps, the plane sighs, the needle breathes through the noren like a small animal finding a path. At the table, the kettle pours its small staccato, and the tea steams like the onsen. Little cups are passed around with a deliberateness that is also affection. The elder offers a scrap of story about a night when the stars came down low enough to touch the roof. Whether true or false is not the point. Things that happen in houses are often less about factuality and more about the practice of remembering. The gardener speaks of a pruning technique that keeps a tree from splitting its own heart, and the innkeeper makes a small sound of approval. The apprentices fold their hands and keep listening. The cat, which has decided the repair work is as good a spectacle as anything, moves between ankles and table legs, and then curls like a comma beside the hearth. The noren's repair proceeds as a quiet liturgy. The stitches bind old cloth to new resolve. The waxed thread darkens in the lantern light and glows like a rope of tiny constellations. The carpenter comes over to check the join and, with a fingertip, tucks a stray fiber into the seam. He does not make a show of his skill. His corrections are like commas in a sentence, necessary, unobtrusive. The apprentice, who has been learning the needle lines, watches how his hands are corrected, and how his mistakes are not derided, but turned into learning. He sees that mending is not about making invisible the work, but about leaving marks that say the house was cared for. As the night deepens, there is a passing of tools from hand to hand that feels like passing a story along a line. The gardener hands the plane back to the carpenter and says simply, "This will sit better," and the carpenter grunts approval. The elder, with a slow smile, arranges slices of preserved daikon on a small plate and offers them to each pair of hands working. The bite is crisp and salted and warms in the mouth like something that has been kept right. Each small offering, tea, daikon, cedar shavings cut into kindling, becomes a stitch in a fabric that is not just the lodge, but the group that keeps it. There is a lull in the work where nothing is done but listening. The apprentices stand, shoulders relaxing, as the innkeeper steps to the window and parts the shoji, the sliding screen of paper set in wood. Outside, the view is a slice of sky above Fuji, caught between branches and steam. The stars are arranged differently now. A thin cloud has moved, and the mountain's flank seems to hold more of the night's depth. The innkeeper traces the skyline with a quiet precision, as if checking the house's relationship to the mountain. Houses are measured by their neighbors, by the tree, by the river, by the peak that stands patient beyond. One apprentice asks, in a voice that wants to be small, "Did you ever think it would wear out?" He points at the noren, at the plank, at all the small things that need attention. The question is broader than laundry or timber. It is a question of everything that requires tending. The innkeeper kneels and touches the noren where the new stitches take light. Everything wears, she says, not as resignation, but as fact. What matters is what you do when you find the wear. They move through the house like a single organism now. Hands finding tools, voices tuning to each other's pace. The carpenter instructs the apprentice on how to test for true. A pace taken across the ngawa, a heel pressed where the joint meets. Listen, he says, and they listen. In the listening, they hear the house answer with a gracious creak that says it will continue. The plank is not yet finished. It is close, a near-true line waiting for the last plane and the final wedge. They leave the board a fraction proud and fraction anxious, the way someone might leave an unfinished letter on a table. There is work left to do, certainly, but also a confidence that the work will be done. Outside, once more, the stars look like a mapped patience. A particular patch above the mountain is dense with pinpricks, and for a breath the innkeeper feels the smallness she often feels, how a house can hold so much life and still be a single roof. The onsen exhales, and the steam drifts in slow curtains. The lanterns bend their light around the path so a traveler can find footing. From somewhere deeper in the lodge, a futon is shaken and folded. A guest will come, or perhaps a late walker will need a bowl and a place to lie down. This is not the first time and will not be the last. Lodges are built as promises to people they have not yet met, yet the night has another motion to it. Midway through the repairs, as the novices sharpen a blade and the elder tells of a winter where the stars were so near you could have counted them with your fingertips, the sound of snow under boot catches the innkeeper's ear. It is faint at first, nothing more than a disturbance in the even hush of the valley, but it moves toward the path in a way that makes the kettle at someone's elbow seem to hiccup. The cat lifts its head, ears pinning like sails. The gardener pauses with a shaving between two fingers, and the carpenter lets his hands rest on the plane. Outside, a figure pauses in the pool of the nearest lantern. They have not guessed yet who the figure might be. An old walker, a younger traveler, someone whose story is known to the village, and someone whose story is not. The innkeeper smooths her hands over the noren to make sure the stitches are singing their small song. She sets the work down and moves to the door with the easy readiness of someone who welcomes without spectacle. She finds herself thinking, without drama, of the simple needs: a bowl to warm, a futon to shake, a towel folded in readiness. Houses that know the practicalities of mercy. At the threshold, she meets the lantern's glow and the shadow stepped out of it. For a second, the stranger is only that. Shadow and steam, breath fogging, snow on shoulders. Then the face becomes a face. Tired, wind-burned, eyes that hold the kind of quiet you find in people who have been traveling and who do not expect to be met with more than a lamp and a kind word. The lantern throws the light into the stranger's features, and in that light the innkeeper sees both the need and the relief that comes when a threshold is there to be crossed. She opens the door wider, so that the heat from inside presses like a hand. The noren moves and makes the signature sound of a housemaking room. Inside, the work stops for a beat, and the group gathers like a small circle of warmth. The apprentice with the sharp saw steps back to let the innkeeper decide. The carpenter rests his palm on the table, ready to resume with the plank. The elder folds his hands and offers a polite smile. Even the cat chooses a place near the fire. The stranger steps in and brings with him the silence of travel, which is not empty but full of stories refused and stories saved. He bows slightly, a practiced gesture of courtesy, and the innkeeper responds with the precise nod of someone who has been taught politeness as an offering. "You will have tea and a futon," she says, and the words are more than logistics. They are a settlement of care. The house answers with small things. A towel is taken from a neat stack. A futon is plumped and set near the hearth. An extra pair of chopsticks is laid out with a quiet calculation that there will be enough. The carpentry table waits. The Norrin waits. The new plank waits for the last plane. The stranger removes his boots and sets them in the gen-con, the small entryway where outdoor and indoor exchange footwear, where the wood holds the pattern of many souls and many small tears. A hand is offered a cup of tea, and the steam fogs and then clears, like breath returned to a body. They do not ask for names at once. Names will come later if they are needed. For now there is a worry about warmth and rest, a concern about what the traveler needs. The innkeeper shows him the onsen, how to enter, how to mind the heat, and the stranger's shoulders unknit as if the soft warmth will smooth the day's stiffness. The lodgers return, one by one, to their tasks, but a new hush threads the work now. The presence of an outsider creates a small courtesy in the house's skin. The apprentice who has been learning the needle feels the change as if it were a draft. He watches the stranger move toward the onsen, and then back again. Towel slung over an arm, eyes catching the mountain for the first time, with a gaze that is not yet full knowledge, but is curiously reverent. The innkeeper meets that glance and nods toward Fuji. The stranger follows her line and looks up. For a moment, the two of them stand as witnesses to a line in the sky, where the stars above the peak hold a cold and steady chorus. And then the work resumes. The carpenter picks up the plane with the clear intent of finishing what must be finished before dawn. The plank must be true. The threshold must not betray a guest in the morning's rush. But there are new small adjustments to be made. A towel to be warmed, a futon to be smoothed, an extra stitch in the Norrin where the tear had once widened. The apprentices return to their places with a tempered energy. They know, by now, that repair is not merely about fixing things. It is about the way a house receives life as a series of tasks folded into hospitality. Outside, the stars remain, a steady field above Fuji, their coldness redeemed by proximity as if that were possible. Inside, the lanterns burn like quiet suns. The lodge hums with the sound of small things being coaxed into order. The planes rasp, the mallets soft knock, the needles whisper. Hands move with the steady economy of people who have learned that haste ruins work, and patience makes it keep. The innkeeper, watching these hands, feels the slow, grateful satisfaction that comes when a house hears itself mended. There is still work left to do, some very small things, and one larger piece, the replacement of the warped plank. The carpenter checks his measurements again, and the apprentice tightens the clamp on the new strip as if hold and pressure were a kind of promise. The stranger, having washed in the onsen and returned pulled to a state of more human warmth, trails in and offers a quiet thanks, nothing elaborate. The innkeeper hands him a bowl and a place near the fire, and the lodgers make room without fuss. For now, the lodge breathes with the rhythm of the repairs and the soft presence of the stranger. The stars above the peak keep their own counsel, and Fuji is a dark, watching shape beyond the trees. A sense of things being set in motion fills the air. The plank will be fitted, the Norrin will be stitched, and will stand as a seam that the house can show with pride. Apprentices will find their hands less tentative in the morning, but these are outcomes that wait for time. As the night edges toward a deeper hour, one of the apprentices steps outside, drawn by the clarity of the stars. He stands a little way from the Ngawa and leans on the railing, breath creating small clouds of silver. Above him, the sky is sharp. The Milky Way is a soft smear that flares and dissolves near the mountain's silhouette. He closes his eyes and listens, really listens, to the house behind him. The kettle's last whisper, the murmur of conversation reduced to the low hum of shared attention. It is, for a moment, an entire world made of small, precise sounds. A soft footstep on the path breaks the hush then, farther off, and the apprentice opens his eyes. It is a sound that might be many things. A late guest deciding, a neighbor coming to lend a tool, the steady approach of something unexpected. He watches the lantern light again, watching as the dark moves at its edges, and the house, attentive as a living thing, tilts toward that sound like a head turning. The innkeeper hears it too, and sets down her cup. The carpenter places a finger against his lip, a silent invitation to listen. They stand like that, listening, waiting, while the stars over the peak hold their cool audience. The threshold between tasks and consequence tightens. A new arrival of any sort will change the evening's course. It might make the house reorganize its small priorities, or might cause the carpenters to set aside a plane in favor of a bowl. Either way, it will turn repair into hospitality in its fullest sense. The giving of shelter. The making of a place where a person can unburden themselves from the cold. The footstep comes closer now. A tread on packed snow that does not hurry but does not dawdle either. The lantern's glow steadies itself against the edge of the path, and a shadow grows to a figure. The innkeeper reaches for the noren and straightens the visible stitches with her palm, as if to reassure the house that it is being looked after. She draws the door, and the room hums with the tiny shift of motion. When the figure reaches the gate and steps into the lantern light, the innkeeper sees it plainly. Coat flecked with snow, breathing gentle but deep, eyes lifted for a moment to where the stars above the peak burn. The stranger's face is calm in the way of someone who has seen much and is still surprised by small kindnesses. The innkeeper moves forward, the house making room as it always does, and the carpenter sets his plane down, fingers sticky with shavings, ready to finish what began earlier in the night. The apprentice watches the exchange, feeling the house settle. There is the rightness of completeness in the moment, and yet there is something held back, a sense that the true completion waits until the plank sings in place beneath the guest's foot in the morning, until the noren's new stitch has been tugged at once or twice by passing hands and still holds. There is still a small distance between this night's quiet repair and the dawn where flaws will be known anew. The apprentice breathes in, the cold riding his lungs like a thin thread, and listens to the innkeeper as she says the words that will make the stranger a guest, and make the house's repair count for what it is. An act of care. Outside, a star over Fuji winks as if in approval. The lanterns sway a little in their warm breath. Inside, the noren curtains stir in the doorway, and the plank awaits its final fitting. The evening holds, a patient thing folded around the lodge, keeping the small circle of people and their hands and their tools. The future. Dawn. The plank finished. The mountain revealed. The stars receding. Waits on the other side of that small, exact work. They let the house rest with the work mostly done, and a hush like cloth pulled over a bowl. Outside, the night kept its folded patience. Inside, People found corners to sleep in, or to sit and watch the small remainder of the evening pass. The innkeeper sat by the hearth for a little while, warming her fingers on a cup, tasting the tea as if it were a way of reading the room. The carpenter wrapped his palms around a piece of oilcloth and lay the plane on the bench to rest. The apprentices, shoulders loosened from hours of careful motion, drifted into futons near the inner rooms. Even the cat, having inspected every tool, found a sunless pocket of warmth beneath the lacquered table, and settled like a small punctuation. A pressure of work lingered behind their eyes. The plank, almost true but not yet singing underfoot, waited for a last measure and a final planing. It was the sort of problem to leave for the light if you could, and the light would come. The lodge kept its rhythm by such small truths, what could be left until dawn, and what must be finished now. They accepted the night's incompletion as a vow kept with the morning. The carpenter stood before the rest. He listened to the house as if to a pulse, and then, slowly, made his excuses. It was not a dramatic departure. He wrapped a scarf and set his feet into boots, the leather breathing in the cold, and moved with the quiet deliberation of a person who keeps his own clock. He stepped out onto the Ngawa while most of the house still held sleep in its pockets. The lanterns were low, wick thinning to watchfulness. Steam rose from the onsen like a column of muted breath. It blurred the nearer trees until they were suggestion rather than shape. He worked without disturbance. His tools came with him. Plane, wedge, mallet, a handsaw with a handle smoothed by years of grip. He set the new strip of oak against the boarding, felt its fit with palms more than with sight, and measured again in that exacting way someone measures a conversation. The apprentice who had slept in the alcove stirred when he felt the floor cool as the carpenter passed. He sat up, blinking away sleep, and stayed quietly to watch. The innkeeper, who had been awake enough to know when something needed finishing, drew back the shoji a hair and let the paper screen keep the cold out while she watched the carpenter move through his checks. Mount Fuji rose as a low, steady shape behind the tree line, darker than the sky, but clearer for the thinning mist that warned of dawn. Above its peak, the stars were still generous, though their edges were softening toward a blue the color of old indigo cloth. The star field seemed to be making way. A few bright points remained, true and stubborn, hanging like pins arranged by a careful hand. The air had the mineral, slight sulfur scent that sometimes accompanied onsen steam in the cold, and it mixed with sap and wood smoke and the faint salt of the artisan's hands. The carpenter began the final work with the same pace he had kept through the night. Slow, precise strokes of the plane, each pass a question and an answer. Shavings came away in long, pale curls and pooled on the floorboards, the sound of them a soft applause in the bare hour. He checked the joint with a small square, tapped the billet in place with a mallet so slight it could have been wind, and tested the gyve with a practiced step. The apprentice watched the plane's arc as if studying a map. How the blade takes the surface, how the heel glides, how a hand modifies its pressure when the grain runs contrary. At one moment the carpenter paused and lifted his face to the mountain. He let the outline of Fuji arrange itself in his consciousness, then returned his attention to the wood. He wanted the threshold to be a conversation partner for the mountain rather than a clumsy interruption. That thought might have been sentiment were it not so practical. Edges that fit better resist the ingress of drafts and snow. Grains that ran together suffered less from winter's contraction. He chose the strip of oak because its grain leaned in the same direction as the lodge's older boards. They would agree rather than argue. His apprentice passed him a wedge carved to a fine taper. The wedge, small in the palm but significant in effect, slid into the joint with a crisp, dry sound. The mallet tapped it until the wedge took, and the boards spoke with the low, rounded sound of finality. The carpenter ran his hand along the surface, feeling for any hairline wobble, and found none. He made a small sound like a satisfied breath, not loud enough to stir the sleeping rooms, but enough to reach the apprentice's ears. As the carpenter worked, the stranger, who had washed and wrapped himself in the inn's dry robes, sat by the fire and watched without intruding. He kept his hands cupped around his bowl, heat rising and fogging over his fingers. He was not idle in the sense of being useless. He offered a folded scrap of paper to the innkeeper when she passed, an old note of thanks left from a traveler long ago. She took it with a small smile and tucked it into the jar with the elder's daikon, as if the jar were a cabinet for small histories. The noren, meanwhile, hung newly stitched along its hem. The apprentice with the needle ran his thumb along the thread he had learned to wax. The wax sat glossy and steady on the fiber, and the stitch held firm. The innkeeper had added a narrow strip of washi to the curtain's lining as the gardener suggested. The paper was thin but dense, translucent when held to light, and it would temper drafts without changing the curtain's tone. The noren's repaired hem shivered once in a stray breeze and stayed. It now read as both seam and scar, a mark that said the place had been looked after rather than repaired to the point of erasure. They worked in that soft, early hour as if completing a public letter, writing the lodge's sentence until it read plainly. The house acknowledged them. Floors creaked in the right places. The kettle's last bubbles sighed and stilled, and somewhere in the back room a futon folded itself with the sleepy authority of habit. The apprentice who had watched the carpenter's blade asked a small question, the sort that arrives from attention rather than curiosity. "How do you know when it's true?" His voice was low, edged with the wonder of someone discovering the grammar of a craft. "Listen," the carpenter replied, and his finger tapped the board. There was a clarity in the cloth-thin sound that the apprentice felt in his teeth. When it sings, you hear no accusing gap. It was as precise an answer as the apprentice needed. He bent his head back to the work and listened, learning to let ears do the measuring his eye could not yet manage. Outside, the sky shifted. A thin line of pale light crept up behind the mountain's flank, a suggestion of day, and with it the great field of stars began to tire. The brightest pins blinked out one by one like candles extinguished by a patient hand, and the mountain's silhouette darkened against the paleening air. The innkeeper moved along the engawa and set the plank in line, checking how its seam read against the doorway. She pressed down a heel to the board, and liked the assurance of the sound. It was modest and honest and true. They allowed themselves a small ritual then, an acknowledgment that was a mix of practical verification and something like blessing. The carpenter drew a bead of oil across the wedge to keep it from sweltering in the morning humidity. The apprentice passed him a cloth, and the elder hummed an old, wordless cadence under his breath as he arranged the preserved daikon on a wooden tray. No one spoke of thanks. Instead, hands exchanged the tools back into their cases, and the carpenter wiped the plane blade with a scrap of oilcloth and slid it gently into remembered grooves. Objects are the custodians of memory in such places, and returning a tool to its place is an unspoken vow to use it well. Light came, not brusque, but gradual, and with it the first true details of the night revealed themselves. The trees nearest the lodge had silvered edges where frost had gathered. The lantern's paper grew paler. The steam from the onsen thinned into ghosting ribbons. Above, Mount Fuji became a quietly precise shape. The star field that had been generous through the deepest night had given way to a softer scatter, and the area immediately above the peak still held a cluster that clung to the last dark like moth-stitched cloth. These remaining stars hung like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise. When the final wedge was set and the plank sat without complaint beneath a test step, there was a small communal let-out of breath. It was not triumphal. It was recognition. The house could feel its seam again, and that felt like a safer place to set one's foot. The innkeeper tapped her palm once on the noren, feeling the stitches beneath. They were warm from the lamp and small under her touch. She left her hand there for a count, and then drew it away as the first gull of the mountain's dawn. Thin, complaining, and not quite awake, cut the air. Breakfast followed in the natural cadence of a place waking. A light broth, keen with kombu's subtle salt. Rice steamed until each grain was rounded with care. Pickles sliced and set beside a serving dish. Little folded omelets cut into measuring pieces, and green tea brewed loose. Leaves unfurling like small sea life. The eldest sat in his accustomed corner and distributed pieces of daikon with a grand, careful hand. The carpenter sat nearest the door. The apprentices sat poised and eager, their fingers still carrying the faint scent of shavings and wax. The stranger, grateful and quiet, accepted a bowl and ate with the attentiveness of someone who has been given shelter before names are exchanged. There was a small exchange of remarks, the sort that has the weight of long friendship without the burden of chronology. The elder told, in a voice that tended toward softness rather than performance, a fragment of advice his father once offered when his father was a man with calloused hands. If a door is mended, a stranger can come in twice without asking twice for kindness. It was less of a proverb and more of a practice note, and the innkeeper received it with a nod that said she had kept it in mind every winter. The apprentices demonstrated what they had learned. One of them took up the noren and bowed it over a plate to show the neatness of the stitch. The other ran his hand along the new plank and stepped across it, listening to the sound as if it were a language. The carpenter offered a modest clap to the latter and rapped the board with the handle of his mallet. The slow, percussive test a mark of approval. The stranger, whose face had relaxed into a rare sort of contentment, lifted his cup in a quiet salute. The gesture small as the rest of the morning, and heavy with the relief of being seen. Food finished, they did not rush into the day. The hour had the light and cadence of ritual. Things done in the right order, because the order was itself a kind of good. The innkeeper set an hourglass on the counter. Sand within it began to pass like a small private tide. She adjusted the lantern in the entry so that its flame would survive the morning draughts, and yet give enough light to catch the travelers' eyes if they came late. She poured a pot of tea and set it on the stoop, wrapped and ready for anyone who might arrive between shifts of labor. It was an unremarkable kindness, and exactly the sort of kindness the lodge had always offered. A bowl to the late walker, a kettle for one who came sudden and cold. Then there was the small ceremony of acknowledgment. The innkeeper walked through the rooms and touched the places that mattered. The futon stacks, the hearth, the noren's visible stitches. When she came to the entrance, she placed her palm where the mend had been most visible, and let it rest. The wood was still a shade cooler than her skin. The stitches beneath the fabric were a firm black line against the curtain's lighter weave. She did not say a thing about permanence. She only let the touch stand as an agreement. This house will hold its people and will be held by them in return. Outside, the sky loosened the night's last points and turned them to dawn. The stars above the peak became thinner, like impressions rubbed on paper. For a long, suspended moment, Mount Fuji stood clear and near. The summit cut a clean line against a sky brightening from indigo to the palest slate. The remaining stars leaned in, and then one by one softened into daylight's patient wash. A few, stubborn as promises, starved into nothing before the sun's edge broke the rim of the world. The innkeeper paused on the Ngawa and watched the mountain, feeling the house breathe with the day. The stranger, having tied his scarf in simple knots, came and stood beside her. He looked up and exhaled, the breath small and full of gratitude. He did not demand stories. He did not offer any. He only looked. They were two witnesses to a morning that had been earned by the quiet labor of keeping and mending. When the breakfast dishes were cleared and the apprentices gathered the few remaining shavings, the elder stood and produced from his pocket a small slip of paper, creased as if it had carried stories. He had found it in the drawer of a previous repair, tucked under a nail where someone long ago must have left a note for luck. It bore a few lines in faded ink, a practical thing about how to fold a corner of a stitch to make it last. He read it aloud because reading scraps aloud is a way of stitching oneself to a lineage. The words were simple. Measure twice, stitch once. Kindness adds the final measure. It was not a revelation, but a reminder, and in the lodge such reminders are a kind of map. They prepared the stranger for the road with the exacting smallness of true hosts. A wrapped portion of rice, a warmed towel folded flat, a piece of cedar tied to his pack as a mark of their care. He bowed, an economy of thanks, and then stepped out into a day that smelled of thaw and of used lantern oil. When his boots struck the path, the repaired threshold answered with a sound that said the house meant what it had promised. The innkeeper watched him go until the last figure of him merged with the lane and the trees. The cat followed the figure briefly with narrowed eyes, and then returned to its chosen sunless patch. The day's work settled into a different pace. The apprentices were asked to tidy the tools and to measure the remaining strips of wood for future repairs. Work that is both practical and didactic. The carpenter, who always kept his silence as a sort of grammar, taught them a finishing technique by slow demonstration. How to draw the plane in a final burnish so that the wood's face took a particular light. The apprentices copied, hands less hesitant than the night before, and the carpenter watched them with a look that might have been pride, edged with the wary caution of the craft. There were small recognitions around the table as they returned to the hearth. The gardener arranged the remaining cedar sprigs in a small corner where their scent would be carried by morning drafts. The elder busied himself with labeling jars of pickles and preserves, each label a tidy promise for the pantry. The innkeeper checked each futon and folded extra blankets into the storage. Her movements were the house's continued conversation. She made nothing showy of it. She simply did what the lodge needed, as it had needed through many winters. Later, as the day warmed, and the bright sun restructured the snow into slanting pools and runnels along the path, the innkeeper gathered a small group on the Ngawa. They sat with their teas and watched the mountain while speaking of small things. A recommended place for a traveler to rest an ankle, how to make a syrup from the reserved fruit, which of the nearby trees would need pruning come spring. The talk was tidy and useful and slow. It was how community tends itself. not by dramatic acts, but by the quiet transmission of knowledge and the steady exchange of favors. She then performed a final house ritual that was less ceremony than habit. She slowed the lantern to its evening wick count in the morning, so the flame would last through variable weather. She flipped the hourglass as if to remind time that the lodge kept its own small measures, and she poured one last pot of tea to be left under the eaves for anyone who might later return in need. Before she folded the Noren and tied it back for the day, she placed her palm upon the repaired seam once more. The stitches were warm and certain beneath her skin. She looked up toward Mount Fuji with a soft smile that was not for display, but for the way the world felt steady. That evening, another night, another stitch in the lodge's long seam, arrived with the promise of familiarity. The lanterns were lit. The onsen exhaled its warm steam into the cold, and for anyone who happened to pause on the path, the Noren and the Engawa read as invitation. The repairs held, and the house whispered of its mended state not as a boast, but as a quiet fact. Before the lodgers settled for the night, the innkeeper prepared a small invitation for those who had kept the house together. They gathered by the hearth, where the light was soft and the air smelled of boiled rice and cedar. The innkeeper spoke then in the modest voice she used for practical things, and her words were not a lesson, but an offering. She thanked the carpenter for his patience, the gardener for his sprigs, the elder for his jars, the apprentices for their eagerness, and the neighbor for the oddments that always somehow came in hand when needed. The stranger, who had returned to the lodge at dusk with a path that had brought him back, sat quietly and said nothing of his name. His thanks was a small bow and the smoothness of his hands around a renewed cup. There was a last, small act before sleep. The apprentices were asked to sit at the Engawa and to watch as the innkeeper drew the Noren aside, and stood for a moment in silence where the night opened to the mountain. Above the peak, on a clear strip of sky, a scatter of stars hung like a delicate clasp. It was not the full field from earlier hours, but enough to remind one how the world dotted itself with light. The apprentices were asked not to speak, only to listen and to feel the rhythm of the house as it breathed. Then, at the innkeeper's prompting, they breathed together. 3 motions of inhale and exhale that tied the human rhythm to the wider nature of the place. Her voice in that moment was low and spare, each instruction more like a nudge than a command. "Take a breath," she said, and they drew air in as if to hold the day into their lungs. The onsen sighed in the dark. The cat shifted like a small, contented comma. "Let it out slow," she continued, and the exhale came, carrying away the tightness of effort and the thin edges of worry. The sound of the breath was a small, collective letting go. "Again, and let the shoulders drop," she offered. And they did, feeling the shape of their muscles loosen as if someone had combed them with a patient hand. The final breath she invited to be long, an inhale that reached up toward the mountain, an exhale that reached out toward the valley. There, for that last breath, she asked them to imagine the steam and the snow drawing together, the steam rising like a soft thought, and the snow settling like a patient answer. For the listener, the innkeeper's voice offered the same measure, a quiet space in which to follow if one wished. Breathe in, breathe out. There was no insistence, only a gentle offering of alignment. When the breathing closed, there was a minute of silence that held more than words. The Noren fluttered a little in a late draft and settled. A stand of steam rolled away from the onsen, and overhead the last small stars winked against Fuji's crown. The repaired plank under the porch bore the imprint of a day's worth of steps, and would for many days to come. It was a visible seam of care, a promise translated into wood and thread. Before they finally turned in, the innkeeper set a pot of tea to cool near the jenkin, and adjusted a lantern so that the pathway would be gentle for any late wanderer. She placed a small sign by the door that simply read, in tidy script, "Welcome." It needed no further flourish. She spent a moment at the threshold. The Norren, the short curtain that marks inside from outside, moved in a slow, careful interval and fell back into place. The stitches along its hem caught the lamplight and held it steady. She put the heel of her hand to the newly fitted plank and felt, for a brief instant, the house's reply. Wood warmed by use, seams that promised to keep doing their quiet work. Above, where the sky lifted and the stars hovered like a halo, Mount Fuji kept its watch. For a long while after, the lodge rested, and the world, for its part, did something it did best. It continued. People would arrive and leave, some to be known, and others to be names remembered only by the knot in a scarf or the impression of a boot. The apprentices would return to the work tomorrow and the next day until the moves of mending felt second nature. The gardener would prune, the elder would preserve, the carpenter would plane, and the innkeeper, always the house's attentive center, would keep the tea warm and the lanterns lit. If you have been with them in this night, the innkeeper offers one last soft invitation before the soundscape takes over and the room is left to its hush. Return when the mountain calls. There are more nights like this waiting, but only if you wish, and if you wish now, take the 3 gentle breaths with her. Sit comfortably or lie down and let your shoulders be heavy. Breathe in slowly. Draw the cool of the evening through your body as if you were inhaling the mountain's calm. Hold it a moment, as if letting steam gather in a cup. Breathe out softly. Release the tightness and let the breath carry itself like a ribbon away into the valley. Breathe in again. This time imagine the lantern's warmth lingering in your chest. Hold it. Breathe out slowly and fully. Let the promise of the repaired threshold, the Norren's stitch, the plank beneath a careful step, settle with you. One last time. Breathe in the hush of the lodge, the scent of cedar and tea, the hush that comes when hands have done their work and the house can sleep. Breathe out and rest. Above, if you look, the stars still hold a steady pin of light above Mount Fuji's peak. The last of them, patient and clear. The lodge breathes with the world. The Norren hangs, and the plank stays true. Lantern light pools at the doorstep, and the onsen sends a soft steam to meet the sky. When you are ready to leave this moment, carry the quiet with you like a small, useful thing. Come back when you wish. The path is kept, and the house will be there. Its threshold mended, its tea warm, and a lantern waiting to mark your arrival.